Suffer the Little Children, Élan School and the Industry of Legalised Child Abuse by Suzuki Nathi. Written June 30th, 2019. Train up a child in the way he should go, and even when he is old he will not depart from it. Proverbs 22:6. Warning. The following story contains graphic material, including images and descriptions of child abuse and dehumanization, which some readers may find disturbing. Discretion is advised. With a population of barely 5,200 people, the town of Poland, Maine is a sleepy little community in rural Androscoggin County, Maine. It is home to the Range Ponds State Park and has been a popular tourist destination for people visiting Upper New England. But for decades, the little town of Poland harbored a dark, disturbing secret. For years, beneath the majestic forests and small-town atmosphere, there lurked what was, by all aspects, one of the most horrific and inhumane institutions ever seen in modern U.S. history. This was the Élan School, an alternative school that ostensibly specialized in behavioral modification for troubled teens, but was, in fact, little more than a horrifically abusive and totalitarian cult founded by a charismatic, sadistic psychopath who made millions of dollars off of his enterprise of evil. For over 40 years, Élan subjected thousands of children to daily abuse, torture, dehumanization, and psychological and physical terror. Their leadership actively encouraged and participated in these horrific activities, taking advantage of their status in order to do so. But the worst part is that everything Élan did, the torture, the terror, the abuse, was completely legal, and, unbelievably, it still is. This is the story of Élan School. It is a horrifying story that shines a light on a clandestine, abusive, inhumane, and grossly under-regulated industry that makes its money off of what is, essentially, legalized child abuse. The story of Élan School could not be told without first addressing the life of its founder and president, the charismatic businessman, politician, and self-made millionaire named Joe Ricci. Joseph J. Ricci had humble beginnings. He was born on August 29, 1946, to an Italian-American family in the town of Port Chester, New York. Ricci's father abandoned his pregnant wife before his son was even born, and Ricci ended up being raised by his maternal grandparents after his mother signed away custody. From a young age, Ricci proved to be an intelligent and very charming person. He was very friendly and talkative, always maintaining a cool-headed attitude around others. He had an ability to act as a leader among his fellow playmates, and many kids often looked up to Ricci as a social role model. But beneath Ricci's charming, amiable, and friendly exterior, there lurked a frightening evil, manipulative, and sadistic personality, consumed by extreme narcissism, disturbing fantasies, and a total disregard for the safety and well-being of others. Ricci, in truth, was, even from an early age, little more than a vile, manipulative, and self-centered psychopath. He thrived on power and dominance, and he did not care who he hurt in order to gain it. From an early age, Ricci developed an insatiable greed for money, and he didn't care how he obtained it, even if it meant stealing. In fact, Ricci's criminal versatility became quite evident even before he was a teenager. While most kids found recreation in games like baseball or basketball, Ricci found pleasure in shooting animals and engaging in acts of theft, robbery, and burglary. Ricci also displayed numerous bizarre and disturbing psychosexual behaviors during his early adolescence. When he was 12, Ricci began dating his middle school science teacher, and he became sexually promiscuous by the time he entered high school. Ricci would often skip class, commit acts of vandalism, break into parked cars, and steal food from restaurants, just for the fun of it. All of this was further evidence that Joe Ricci was, in fact, a highly dangerous, narcissistic, and sadistic psychopath. He was, in the truest sense, a personification of evil itself. When he was 15, Ricci was seriously injured in a car accident and spent months in hospital recovering. He was given massive amounts of painkillers, which he would soon become dependent on even after his release. Ricci descended into a life of drug addiction and petty crime, stealing money and using it to fuel his heroin cravings. After a stint in a juvenile prison, Ricci dropped out of high school in 1966. He never went to college, and for the next several years, he rapidly shifted between multiple jobs trying to find employment. In 1967, Ricci was soon arrested again, this time for robbing a mail truck, but the skilled charmer and manipulator was able to talk his way out of a prison sentence. Ricci was instead sent to a rehabilitation center in Connecticut as part of a plea bargain that kept him out of jail. In 1969, Ricci married and moved to Quincy, Massachusetts, where he briefly ran a drug rehabilitation center called Survival Incorporated. This business earned Ricci a small fortune. After all, the rampant drug use seen in the 1960s had produced a whole host of addicts seeking treatment, and Ricci's center soon became flooded with patients. Ricci also became involved in Maine's emerging gambling business. He became the owner of the famous Sauber Downs racetrack in Sauber, Maine, where he earned millions of dollars from horse racing. As the owner of the track, Ricci was often accused by his employees of being abusive, both physically and emotionally, and he was sued 3 times by female employees for sexual harassment and death threats. Additionally, Ricci was accused of docking his workers' pay if they criticized him, and he often clamped down on labor unions that challenged his policies. But legitimate businesses weren't the only way that Ricci earned his fortune. During the 1960s and 70s, Ricci also allegedly aligned himself with the Northeast's vast criminal underworld. As the owner of one of New England's largest gambling establishments, and because of his Italian-American ancestry and New York connections, Ricci had many suspected ties with organized crime syndicates like the Mafia, and he was investigated numerous times by the FBI for being involved in underground gambling establishments, extortion rackets, and trafficking operations. The full extent of Ricci's connections to the criminal underworld will never fully be known. When the FBI first publicly linked Ricci to the Mafia, he sued them for defamation. Ricci won the case, and $15 million, but evidence of his ties to organized crime is still abound. Despite having no secondary education, Ricci managed not just to become a multi-millionaire before he was 30, but also became the owner of the largest gambling establishment in the state of Maine, an establishment which was known by the FBI to have ties to the infamous Patricia crime family. Yet, despite being the subject of more than a dozen criminal investigations throughout his life, Ricci always seemed to be vindicted. Furthermore, it is alleged that several people who were known to have come into contact with Joe Ricci during the 1970s later turned up dead under suspicious circumstances. One of these people was Michael J. Little Joe Napolito, a New England underworld figure whose dismembered body was found in the trunk of a car in New York City in 1978. The killing was later tied to the Patricia family, a well-known organized crime outfit in New England that, incidentally, had a big investment in Sauber Downs. Whether Ricci had any involvement in Napolito's demise is still unknown. Whilst the FBI considered him a person of interest, saying that there was evidence that Ricci had set Napolito up for a hit, they never pressed charges. But the idea that Ricci could have been involved in such a crime is by no means implausible. Morality, ethics, and common humanity were concepts totally foreign to Joe Ricci. If it meant earning him money, power, or status, Ricci would have undoubtedly committed murder without giving it so much as a second thought. During the 1970s, the youth of America were consumed by the rebellious hippie subculture. Kids openly revolted against the strict system they had been raised in, challenging conservatively held traditions and vying for more social freedom. Some kids would run into trouble with the law, become involved in drug use or sexual promiscuity, and engage in truancy from school. This created a sort of moral panic amongst the older generation, who sought to repress such behaviours among youths. Many adults believed that the way to combat this new, rebellious, troublesome attitude amongst teens was to forcibly correct their supposedly deviant behaviour, often enrolling them in controversial alternative schools for troubled teens. It was here that Joe Ricci saw an opportunity, not just to earn money, but also to set a disturbing fantasy of his own into action. Ricci, being a domineering narcissist, craved adoration and worship from others, and he thrived on power, control, and domination over those he considered inferior. In a more vindictive sense, Ricci had apparently harboured a hatred of teenagers, and he may have seen this rising industry as an opportunity to put his sadistic fantasies into action. In 1970, Ricci met a child psychiatrist named Gerald Davidson, who specialised in adolescent behaviour modification programs, especially in regards to drug abuse and criminal versatility. This subject fascinated Ricci, and he and Davidson soon decided to establish their own alternative school for troubled teens. While Davidson may have been motivated by a genuine desire to help steer troubled kids back onto the right path, it is abundantly clear that Joe Ricci's motivations were not altruistic in any sense. Ricci's motivations, as always, were little more than money and power. Ricci saw the possibility of running a behavioural school as an opportunity to exert strict dominance and power over others, without the law taking an interest in his activities. It was, in the end, a perfect loophole for Ricci to set his sadistic fantasies into action. This was evident enough even by the location Ricci chose to establish his new school. He chose the state of Maine because they had the least strict laws regarding such facilities in the entire northeastern region of the United States. Ricci would be able to create his own totalitarian empire with little worry of the state taking action against him. In 1974, Ricci and Davidson set up camp in the small, rural town of Poland, Maine, and in the middle of the dense Maine wilderness, Ricci purchased a 33-acre area of land with an old hunting lodge, cleared out the property, and constructed a series of trailers and buildings to serve as his new behavioral modification school. Ricci named the institution Élan, a word meaning energy or enthusiasm. Using his skillful charm and charisma, Ricci managed to construct a veil of legitimacy surrounding this new school of his, painting it as a source of salvation for a troubled child. Ricci billed Élan School as a radical new treatment centre that would correct rather than punish bad behaviour by teens. Ricci painted himself as a mentor of sorts who would guide troubled kids back onto the right path towards leading productive, better lives. Everything at Élan, Ricci said, was geared towards helping troubled teens reintegrate into society. Ricci's sales pitch was extremely successful. Within 1 year, Élan's enrollment grew from 4 children to more than 100. Parents of troubled teens as well as juvenile court judges began sending youngsters to Élan from all across the United States. But Élan's true purpose was far more sinister. It was structured less like a school or rehabilitation centre and more like a totalitarian cult centered around abuse, rigid discipline, and dehumanization. It was, in the end, a window into Joe Ricci's evil, putrid, and twisted soul. A window into a scene of hell itself. Those who suffered the greatest in Élan were its students, the children who usually, between the ages of 12 and 18, came from all sorts of different backgrounds. Some were orphans sent by guardians who couldn't take care of them. Others were juvenile offenders ordered to enroll in Élan as a part of a criminal sentence. Some were heirs of multi-millionaires who were enticed by the idea of a boarding school in the middle of the woods. And some were kids who were having academic trouble. And then there were those who were neither troubled kids, outlaws, or school dropouts. They were depressed, suicidal, or worse, simply misunderstood. These kids suffered from mental illness, chronic depression, or autism spectrum disorder. They were sent to Élan solely because they were different, because they couldn't fit in with others, and because their parents and guardians believed that their condition was a mere behavioural phase that could be cured with rigid discipline. This was the most disturbing aspect of Élan's enrollment. These autistic or mentally ill children needed support and treatment. They needed to be understood and loved, but blinded by ignorance and convinced that aggressive therapy could somehow change who their kids were, the parents of these youngsters instead sent them off to Élan, the worst place they could possibly go. None of the teens enrolled in Élan deserved the horrors and the cruelty that awaited them, but the students who were no more than socially awkward teens and who already lived extremely difficult lives with autism, mental illness, chronic depression, or schizophrenia, they deserved it the least. The horrors of Élan School were so extensive and so intricate that they began even before the student could enter the institution's campus. They involved secrecy, dishonesty, and in some cases, outright deception. First, the parents of a supposedly troubled teen would come across one of Élan's many advertisements, often in a newspaper or by mail. The parents of this teen would read about how Élan's revolutionary style of therapy was designed to radically change a troubled teen from a social deviant to an upstanding citizen. Certainly, this was an appealing message to parents who were concerned about their child's troublesome behaviour. The parents would then contact the staff at Élan and arrange to send their children there in order to undergo this behavioural therapy. Each child would earn the school about $50,000 to $60,000, so Ricci went through great lengths to encourage parents to send their children to Élan. Oftentimes, the teens would not be notified of this decision. They would have no say or choice whatsoever. And because Élan's enrollment process hinged on the element of surprise, the school went to horrific lengths to ensure that teens attended the school. Once everything was in place, Élan would hire a teen escort company to literally abduct the teenager in the middle of the night from their bedroom and bring them to the school. Such companies are not only legal, but they still exist today. The men would break into a teen's bedroom, physically subdue him, tie him up with plastic handcuffs, throw him into a van, and then drive off to Poland, Maine, where he would be handed over to Élan School. Such experiences often traumatized the teens who were abducted. For all they knew at first, they were being taken by criminals to be held for ransom, tortured, or worse, killed. For the girls, it was even more terrifying. Some girls later recalled that they believed they were going to be raped, sexually assaulted, and murdered by their abductors. One certainly cannot blame the kids for thinking this way. Such practices had the hallmarks of a violent kidnapping. Actually, that was exactly what it was. From the beginning, Élan was crafted to dehumanize and demoralize the students who went there, seeking to destroy their sense of human dignity and turn them into little more than obedient slaves. This would be achieved through an abhorrent style of psychological warfare. Everything about Élan, even its location, was crafted around this. Élan was located down a long dirt road in the middle of the Maine wilderness, completely cut off from the rest of society and far away from any civilization. The school itself was made up of little more than dilapidated trailers and buildings. It looked menacing, intimidating, and evil. Many former students still recall the feeling of dread that came over them when they first saw the school. Many times these students would try to run as soon as they saw the school, but burly guards waited in the woods around Élan, waiting to seize any escapees. They were not afraid to get violent with the students. If anything, they took sadistic pleasure in getting physical with the fleeing kids. This, too, was intended to dehumanize the students of Élan. It ingrained into their minds that they were no longer human beings with basic rights. They were prisoners, captives, and hostages to the school. They had no rights. They were powerless. They were slaves for Élan and nothing more. In fact, it was Joe Ricci who put it best when he was interviewed by NBC News in 1979.
At Élan, the first thing they learn is, you're not going to get out of here. If you burn the place down, we'll sleep in a tent together. No matter how many times you run away, we will go and get you.
Once a teen was brought to Élan, the first phase of dehumanization would begin. The student would be forced into a shower where, with no privacy, he would be forced to undress and give all his clothes and valuables to the school. He would be presented with no image clothes, bland, colourless clothing that erased all sense of individuality. It was here that Élan began to really demonstrate its cult-like structure. Much like the cults of Aum Shinrikyo and Heaven's Gate, Élan School sought to raise the past lives of its students, mold them into mindless, obedient servants, and permanently cut them off from the outside world. Each new initiate would be assigned a big brother, an older student who would act as a sort of guide. He would help the new student into his life in Élan, but also act as a sort of jailer, enforcing rules and reporting infractions to Élan's leadership. The big brother would educate his partner about why Élan's program was good for him and why he was a failure if he did not accept it. The big brother was not a friend to his partner. In fact, big brothers would often play cruel tricks onto their companions, pretended that they wanted to run away and then swiftly reporting them to administration once their companion agreed to escape with them. Much like what was seen in the infamous Stanford prison experiment, the big brothers often took sadistic pleasure out of using their superiority against lesser students. Also like a cult, Élan had a very bizarre, strict social hierarchy. Each hierarchy was subject to different rules and regulations. Everything from when you could eat to who you could talk to depended on your position within the hierarchy. Élan was divided into two classes of student: strength students and non-strength students. Non-strengths weren't permitted under any circumstances to talk to other non-strengths. Only strengths could talk to non-strengths. Another cultist tactic employed by Élan was physically severing all ties between students and the outside world. After arriving at Élan, students had to write a guilt letter to their parents explaining why they deserved to be at Élan and not at home. These letters would be inspected carefully by staff. Usually students would have to write 4 or 5 revisions of the letter before it would be sent home. While some students could earn the privilege of being able to call home once a week, they were still subject to heavy restriction. All phone lines in Élan first went through a switchboard outside a trailer within the complex. An operator controlling the switchboard would connect the student with their parents on the other end of the phone line. Students were given a short amount of time on the phone, and the entire time the student would be talking, school staff would be listening in on the call. Above all, much like Joe Ricci, Élan thrived on absolute dominance and power over others. Every freedom, from when one could use the bathroom, to whenever one could look outside the window, to when one could speak, sit down, shower, eat, or even look at someone else, was taken away. The students were left utterly powerless and subservient to Élan's system of draconian tyranny. Violating any of Élan's many rules was called guilt. All guilt, no matter how small or insignificant, was punished severely. Élan's list of forbidden activities was set to an impossibly draconian standard. They included, but were by no means limited to, talking too quietly, talking too loudly, talking to someone without authorization, talking to a non-strength while being a non-strength, talking too much, not talking enough, sex. This word means more than it implies. For instance, talking to or even looking at someone of the opposite gender was considered sex. Looking at someone of the opposite sex, avoiding someone of the opposite sex, being attracted to someone, looking outside, looking at the floor, having negative body language, reacting to insults, slouching or yawning, reading or writing, I most certainly would have violated this, drawing, not falling asleep, sleeping for too long, laughing at a joke made by someone of a higher rank, doing poorly on academics, feeling tired, speaking without permission, eating after designated meal times, not eating at all, going outside without permission, rolling your eyes, attempting to run away, swearing without permission, smiling without permission, not smiling enough, making any sort of physical contact, even shaking hands was forbidden, wearing clothes with image, having bad thoughts, showing or voicing any dissent. These rules were, of course, impossible to follow, and that was essentially the point. Élan students were set up to break the rules no matter how hard they tried. There's no way around it. It was yet another tactic the school used to dehumanize the children. Oftentimes, students would be ordered to write down their guilt on paper. Guilt, such as being attracted to someone, which is quite common for teenagers, or feeling reluctance at completing tasks. They had to write down every little private thought in their head, even their most personal fantasies, and show it to administration, who in turn would use this sensitive information to humiliate or even blackmail them. Élan erased all sense of privacy and personal business. There were no secrets, and there was no confidentiality. All guilt was made public, no matter what it was or how personal it may have been. And it wasn't like one could commit guilt without being caught either. All students were constantly under watch by individuals known as expediters, special teens who acted as guards and carried clipboards listing each student in a designated section of the building. The expediters would carefully observe the individual students for signs of guilt and would write down every infraction in a notebook and turn it in to the administration. The clipboards were always full of infractions committed by students. Nobody went a day without committing guilt. In fact, if an expediter did not report enough guilt to satisfy the administration, he himself would be severely punished. Yes, in Élan, not listing enough guilt was itself guilt. All guilt, no matter how seemingly insignificant or small, was punished. Punishments for guilt were called learning experiences, or LEs, and they were built on the abject of humiliation. Among teenagers, humiliation is depressingly effective at demoralizing and dehumanizing its victims, and Élan took full advantage of this. For instance, those who tried to escape from Élan were designated split risks. Split risks didn't have to actually attempt to escape. Being sad, looking outside, or even merely thinking about escaping was enough to designate someone a split risk. Teens who were designated split risks were given shoes without laces and forced to wear bright yellow t-shirts and skimpy little pink shorts. If they ran away more than once, they would be forced to wear a pink rabbit suit, walk without any shoes, and wear leg shackles. Students who did poorly on their academics were forced to wear humiliating signs, listing their offences, and giant dunce caps all day long. They were subject to verbal abuse by their peers and teachers. If a student smiled without permission, he or she would sometimes be regulated to shut-down duty, where they would be forced to do menial jobs all day long, such as mopping floors, scrubbing trash cans, washing dishes, or cleaning urinals and toilets, sometimes with nothing but a toothbrush. And if a student acted in a way the administration deemed immature, they would be forced to wear diapers over their clothes, put binkies in their mouths, and walk around carrying rattles. But the worst form of punitive humiliation at Élan was something called a general meeting. If a student committed guilt, a school administrator would often yell, "General meeting," and the entire student body would convene in the dining room in front of the unfortunate student. A broomstick would be placed on the floor in front of the infractor, behind which all of the students would gather. "Get off your feelings," the administrator would yell. Then each and every student in the room would launch a screaming, shrieking, deafening torrent of abuse at the unfortunate teen, mocking, degrading, insulting, and screaming their vile, vulgar pejoratives right at his or her face. "Fuck you," they would often yell at the student. "You're a worthless piece of shit. Who the fuck do you think you are, motherfucker? We all hate you. You are a worthless piece of fucking trash, you fucking scumbag." This would go on uninterrupted for up to 40 minutes. It didn't matter if the teen broke down crying or begged for them to stop. The screaming would continue until the teen was thoroughly, mentally, and emotionally broken. General meetings were a very commonplace occurrence, happening almost every single day, and usually multiple times a day. A day without one was an extreme rarity. General meetings were intended not just to dehumanize and mentally destroy the victim of the abuse, but also the other students who participated in the abuse. Élan turned its students into living weapons and took away the humanity of the abuser and the abused alike. It destroyed one's sense of self-worth and independence, reducing them to mindless robots controlled by the sadistic deviants who ran the school. Not participating in a general meeting was considered guilt, and, as always, was a punishable offence. Élan also exerted control over the students through another tactic common with the cults: starvation and sleep deprivation. A typical day at Élan was divided into 3 parts: school, sleep, and the program. The name for Élan's unique brand of therapy. Unlike most American schools, which run between 8 a.m. and 3 p.m., Élan's school classes lasted from 7 p.m. to 11 p.m. This was not by accident. Joe Ricci understood that teenagers would be more susceptible to suggestion and easier to control if they were sleep deprived. Similarly, while Élan did have designated meal times, called meal kicks, for its students, these meals were ludicrously short. Officially, they would last between 5 to 8 minutes, but oftentimes would only last 1 to 4 minutes. Students were often served food according to rank, so many times students wouldn't even have the chance to receive their food before mealtimes ended. Eating after mealtimes was considered guilt, and like all infractions, it was severely punished. Many students would have to go to class hungry, exhausted, and sleep deprived. For a facility that claimed to worship education, Élan also left a lot to be desired for when it came to academics. School only lasted for 4 hours, and students were told to grade their own work. There was no music class, art class, or comprehensive curriculum. There were no tests, group projects, or tutors, and the school did not supply any materials such as backpacks, notebooks, or study materials. As a result, the kids learned very little with regard to academics, and former students reported that they had received the equivalent of only a freshman-level high school education. After school ended at 11 p.m., the students would be sent to their rooms, which were military-style barracks with bunk beds. But even then, sleep would elude the students. Guards called night owls waited both outside and inside the dorm rooms, shining flashlights across the bunk beds, counting and recounting the students to ensure none of them had run away. Sometimes they would yank back the bed sheets to ensure a student was still there. Getting a good night's sleep at Élan was next to impossible, as was any chance of escape. Guards waited in the hall, on the grounds, and in the surrounding woods. Nobody could get away. And all of this was to say nothing of the rampant sexual abuse within Élan. While many details still remain scant, several former residents of Élan, both former students and staff, have been accused of committing horrific acts of sexual abuse against the teens enrolled in the school. Numerous girls have come forward alleging they were raped, sexually assaulted, or molested by Élan staff. The stories give an insight into the horrors that went on in Élan while the administration ignored, or worse, participated in the acts. One girl said that when she was 15, she was raped and brutalized behind the school trailers by Élan resident Ronnie Evans. Evans was also allegedly raped by another female classmate in the woods who enrolled at the school. Despite being disciplined for these acts, Evans was never charged with the crime, and in fact was made a staff member for Élan just months later. In another instance, a male member of staff at Élan stripped naked and exposed himself in front of a female student, repeatedly asking her what she felt about it. The staff member told the teen that this was part of her rehabilitation process, calling it love therapy. Even Joe Ricci was accused of committing sex crimes against the students at Élan. According to a former Élan resident, Ricci was known to have numerous inappropriate relationships with the young girls enrolled at the school. Other times, Ricci would facilitate the sexual abuse. The same former resident recalled an incident in which he said Ricci put a teenage girl into a room with 2 boys with criminal records for rape. Ricci told the boys to do what you want with the girl, who was then violently, sexually assaulted. Nightmares don't even begin to describe life at Élan. It was the closest thing to hell on earth. Verbal and mental abuse was one of Élan's most feared weapons, but it was by no means the only one in their arsenal. If a student somehow managed to put up with being mercilessly degraded and insulted by his peers, he would face the ultimate punishment that Élan could offer. A punishment that was representative of the foundations of evil that Élan was built on.